Hi, everybody, and welcome to the HCD VidCast. This is episode 20 of our Curious Conversations. That's 20 episodes now. That's really amazing. And this one is all about data visualization, about the approach. And today is particularly cool because we have a guest with us. And I'll introduce her in just a second, but this is Michelle Niedziela talking, PhD in behavioral neuroscience and VP of Research and Innovation at HCD. As always, I am joined by Kathryn Ambroze. Kathryn.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm so excited that this is our 20th vidcast. It feels like a very quick road, but it's been fun. And I am very excited that we're finishing off this first season with the lovely Amanda. So if Amanda wants to introduce herself and share a little bit about your role at HCD.
Sure, I'm happy to be here. My name is Amanda Golod. I'm the Director of Analytics at HCD. I've been here for about 10 years, and I am one of the people on our team that work on reporting on taking data and putting it into presentations and graphs. And so this is right up our alley.
Awesome. And thank you so much for joining us. It's so cool. We can actually have people join us in these conversations. So it's not just everybody hearing Kathryn and I go on and on and on. Having someone who really is in the thick of it in a particular topic really helps. For those of you that are new, welcome to the vidcast. Those of you that are returning, welcome back. In case you're not familiar with us, HCD is a research house that focuses on how consumers perceive, evaluate, and respond to different types of stimuli. We use all sorts of different approaches from neuroscience and psychology, as well as traditional market research, anything from the early stages of exploration to the end stages of validation, from product development all the way through end stages of marketing mix. We do this in person and online. It's been done all over the world. And, you know, we're very excited to always talk about new ways to visualize things or approach things or basically make research and data really accessible to clients and everybody that's interested in any of it. And this brings up a really interesting point as we launch right into our conversation. What is data anyway? So I say it that way because I say data, and I'm pretty certain that Kathryn and Amanda say data. Yes?
Yeah. So it also depends on, you know, whatever comes out of my mouth. But I do think because you're from down south, that maybe that might have something to do with it.
Oh, contraire. Yes, I am from the South, but it turns out you can say it either way. It's okay to say data or data. Now, officially in the textbooks or the dictionaries, the correct pronunciation is supposed to be data. However, it's something you can say either way, and honestly, we don't care. So I just want to warn everybody ahead of time that I will say data, and Kathryn will say
probably data.
and Amanda will say
probably data.
All right, and that's okay. We are accepting here of all forms of data and data. And we're actually going to focus on not that. We're going to focus on what you do with it, right?
Exactly. So launching right into this, what is data anyway? There you go. Now I'm just going to be thinking about the right way to say it, honestly.
I'm giving you a complex, sorry.
But I think it's really a good foundational thing to mention that data really does come from absolutely anything, and that in our research at HCD, we often see it through behaviors or through survey responses or psychological or physiological responses, but it really can come from just about anything. Right, Amanda? So moving forward, we'll just touch on exactly, so if we have all this data, what's the important thing to consider is that you collect
because
all
data
this
can be like numbers, like collections of numbers, right? Or it can be, you know, collections of words, any of those things. But if you just have like a pile of numbers that you have either written out on paper, right? Or like, let's imagine a class, right, in school where everybody's gotten scores on an exam. And there's 20 people in the class and each one of them has a different score. That's great right? Everybody's got their score, but if you want to find out something else, we have to be able to put it all together, right?
Exactly. So the goal in terms of how to use the data is really important, and that you want to build a story from the data. And I think that's where data visualizations become so important. And I know that Amanda has had a lot of experience through the work that we do at HCD in creating data, and that it is important that when you're creating this information, you have to keep in mind what the point of the visual is.
Right. It needs to be clear, I would assume, as well, because, for example, in the chart that we have here on the left, you want to have things clearly labeled. You want to understand the sizes, like what they mean. So it's got the numbers here on how big those things are. The infographic on the right, which is, another form of data visualization, being able to sort of lay it out there, color code it, give it some context. But that one's pretty busy, right? So I think, it is a question, Amanda, so like, how do you feel about like what is your experience on people being able to clearly understand a graph?
Yeah, and I think one of the key things that we always say is that you can do the best research possible, but if you can't articulate and clearly communicate to whoever the intended receiver of the data is, then it can fall a lot less meaningful than it should if you can't really communicate clearly what the data is showing us. So we definitely try to make it as clear as possible in utilizing different types of graphs depending on what story we're trying to tell, highlighting things, boxing things when we're doing reporting, trying to keep it less information. We don't want to pile, even if we make really good charts, we don't want to put like 6 charts on one single slide to try to communicate one idea. So it's breaking it up and making it easily digestible. So definitely even like the infographic on the right, while it may be showing a lot of information, it can get busy for what we're trying to communicate. So trying to make sure that anybody really who can look at our graphs and look at any type of reporting or papers we do should really be able to take away easily and quickly what we're trying to communicate and not need a lot of education in graphs and mathematics and statistics to be able to understand what we're communicating.
Because there's some people who have never even seen a graph or read a graph, so they may not even be able to like right away get that, as things move along in a, horizontal path, that you're getting larger, right? Like basics.
Yeah, and that's what I think is one of the interesting things about what we do and people that we work with, that we can work with people from people who have a lot of experience in an education in statistics and mathematics and graphs. And then we have other teams of clients and stuff that we work with that have other main responsibilities, and they just want the information out of the research that we're doing, and they're not as familiar with graphs. So making sure that we can fit the needs of all of those people is a big task that we try to improve on and tackle every day.
That makes sense. And I think with this, a big part of it is also just promoting and understanding that story. And to your point, without the person needing to put too much energy into looking at it, they should be able to see the graph and be able to get just intuitively something out of that graph. And the impression that you get initially from that graph will have a big influence on the person's takeaways, right?
Yes, yeah, and we try to, whenever we share stuff, we always try to give key takeaways and make those clear and concise as possible. So it's not always even needing to fully understand the graph themselves, but the clearer and easier it is, the more digestible and the more chance you have of the reader taking away the information that you're trying to share.
That's awesome. And just one thing I want to mention while we're on this slide is that there are some truly horrible graphs out there that are on Reddit. And there's this, so both of these were taken from Reddit, and one of them is from this Reddit that is called Data is Beautiful, and one of them is taken from a Reddit that's called Data is Ugly. So if anybody is interested, there are plenty of places you can look to see ways that data is misused and misconstrued, and then ways that it's done really well.
Right. So kind of moving along, there's like a billion options out there, right? So like you can have something that's more wordy, something that's totally pictorial, something that has numbers, something that uses up space, right? But it's all about getting at that same goal of telling the story.
There's some data that can be shown multiple ways. There's some things that are only good for certain, like for example, the word cloud is only going to, of course, be used for certain data that we have that includes words. And like the heat map that I know we'll get into, that you can't really do, like if you just ask a yes/no question, you're not really going to heat map that. So it's definitely using the right graphs for the right question and the data that we have.
And I think that also these graphs give some type of context to reflect what you're trying to convey too. So it really does go to that theme of sharing a story and making it easier to add to whatever story we're trying to share with the viewer.
And sometimes I think for us, when it comes to working with clients, it ends up being a little bit dependent on what they're used to working with or what they prefer. So, and also sometimes what's popular at the moment, right? So like word clouds were really popular for a moment, but they can be misleading for sure, right?
Oh,
yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. There's definitely, I mean, in all of these, and that's the really interesting thing about it, a lot of different graphs, you can look at pros and cons of everything and things that there's certain data, even though you have words, it may not fit into a word cloud because of that point, that there are situations where it could be misleading, depending on how similar responses are or what you're asking. So it's a lot of, like Kathryn was pointing out, that's what we pride ourselves in, is trying to tell it as a full story and what is going to fit in based on what the data is telling us. How are we going to life to communicate to a client?
Yeah. And I think within those options and, thinking about how it can be manipulated a little bit, graphs can be manipulated to tell the story you want, right? So like you can change the scale. So like on the right-hand side, that graph up top, that's 0 to 300, like if you had it scaled to 0 to 1,000, suddenly everything would look really small, right? So that could be misleading.
Yes, you can, and that's something that's easily done, and why when we're even doing things, we try to caution our clients to not play around with things that we create, because you can, if you want to make things bigger, you can change an axis if you want to make it smaller, but that's not, if that's not what the data is telling us, then we don't want to manipulate it to make it seem like someone's doing better or worse than they actually. We need to let the data tell us what people are responding, or what survey results are, what the answers are, not what we want them to be. So going in with a neutral opinion on our end, and just letting the data talk instead of having some motive or way that we're trying to share it.
Right. Because I think sometimes in the news, like you have to be cautious sometimes with the graphs that you see that are either printed in a newspaper or like on the news. Sometimes it can be misleading, right?
Right. Yeah, I find myself sometimes not getting too far in. So I find myself sometimes when we're looking at, when the news is on, or when I see articles looking at graphs and saying that, depending on the source, that's not necessarily what that graph is telling you. And you can spin and twist it and turn it and try to find what you want it to tell you. But there is definitely a lot of misinterpretation out there, and trying to just take away what you want to take away, not what is actually the takeaway.
Absolutely.
Right. So going into that topic, to try to avoid having people be misled, I think it's really great that we're going to just discuss a couple fundamental graphs that we're going to just highlight so we can be aware if there are red flags in any data visuals, or maybe you're working with some data and you're interested in finding ways to use the right data to share your story. So we're going to touch on this. I think one of the most well-known graphs is the line charts, right?
Yeah, and we use this a lot for psychophysiological measures, because it is really useful when you're doing something over time. So when you have a multi-point axis, whether it is trends in what somebody is doing, like purchase data, for example, like how many units were being purchased in this year, how many were being purchased in this year. It can show trends over time. We use it when we're exposing someone for say a 30-second, 60-second period and collecting measures to see what that journey looks like over time. So it definitely is helpful when you're looking at some type of over time data to find trends, or like I said, that journey or experience that people are going through. If it's like we have that 30-second in the moment versus year over year or month over month.
That makes sense. So it's really giving you that full experience, that it's from start to finish of whatever they're being exposed to or whatever they're, experiencing at that point.
Yeah, or one set time of information. Maybe it's not an experience. Maybe it's, like I said, the like purchase data or something along those lines. So if we're looking at a few years of data, and we want to look at trends that have been happening, then we can see, like if we do waves and things like that of research, we can see how things have changed over time.
Great. And then the other really, really common one, I feel like you can't have a line graph without discussing bar charts, because these are also really frequently utilized. And I think this is probably one of our most commonly utilized ones too when we are creating decks, because a lot of times with survey responses, this can be really helpful in helping to just sort out things like survey responses.
Yeah, so definitely we'll use bar charts if appropriate when we're doing, say, a multi-select question where things can then add up to more than 100. So like the chart you have on the right, that's a bar charts over time, multiple bar charts. You can see 90% and then 80%. So they can say, I drink this and I also drink this, those types of data points. We also use it to sometimes represent our Likert scales. So we can look at things like top 2 box percent, top 3 box, bottom 2 box, those kinds of percentages. You can do regular bar charts. You can break those into categories doing stacked bar charts, which is another type. We also use it to try to show multiple things at once. So trying to make it clear, say we want to show the top 2 and the mean of a scale that we're doing, if the story or if it's appropriate to do so. So there's definitely a lot of uses, and it can make it really clear. And it's a good visual instead of, say, I've seen a lot of times where people just do lots and lots of tables. And be the same data in a table, like this graph on the right, I could make a table and just put the percentages, but really being able to visualize the differences. You can really see there's a difference between seeing the number 96 and 56 or seeing the difference between the actual categories is very visual and a lot easier for someone to take away than just understanding the numbers.
That makes sense. I was curious. So when we're looking at bar charts, do you think that the width makes any difference? Have you seen bar charts where maybe the width is bigger and it takes up a larger space compared to another one where the percentages may be smaller? Could that be misleading, or do you think that would actually help the data visual?
I think it depends on the amount of options you have. So this, if you only had 2 options, you could let it take up a bigger space because you only have 2. So we do sometimes make the bar charts thicker just so to take up a little bit more space. I think that what could be misleading is the width, the sideways, so that is on an axis. So similar to what Michelle was saying before, it looks like this is probably on like the 0 to 100%, but if I made it 0 to 300%, then all of those shrink, then that would definitely be misleading. Especially I've occasionally seen where looking at different data online that people within the same story or the same survey will use different widths. So one may show you a similar question, 0 to 100 scale. Another one will be on a 0 to 400 scale. So 96% in 2 different graphs looks like it's a different size.
Oh, absolutely.
Let's compare those. That is certainly misleading. It looks like one is less than the other, but it's actually the same response. So that definitely is something that could end up misleading. If that answers your question.
Oh, totally. Yeah. And then we're going to just touch on some pie charts. Can you give us an overview of how you're using pie charts and things like that? I love the Pac-Man one. I think I know it's a classic, but I love it.
Yeah, that's a funny one. I actually have not seen the Pac-Man one before. That's really cool.
Again, it's data's beautiful.
Yeah. So
I actually like the one where it's like a pie chart that shows pizza, and part of it is pizza that has not been eaten versus pizza that's been eaten.
Yes. Yes, I've actually seen that. A random fact, I was looking at like Father's Day matching shirts, and I almost got one because of the math nerd in me for my husband that was like a pizza, and it was most of the pizza on his shirt, and then on my son's shirt would be like the one slice of pizza.
Oh,
The rest of the pizza. I thought that was super cute. Just because when I saw it, it did make me think of that. But maybe that's why pizza is one of my favorite foods. But anyway, so one of the things we use pie charts, I think that pie charts are a lot of people are familiar with them, and I think that it's very easy visually to understand. So we use that a lot if you have like we call a single select question. So if I give you 5 options, like what time of day do you shower, morning, afternoon, or night? And I don't know why that's the question I thought of, but that if it's an option where you select one and your sum is adding up to around 100, then you can easily break that out and show the different options. A time where it starts to get confusing and you want to start looking at other options is if you have too many things. So if I ask you what brand of X do you use most, but there's 30 brands, there's going to be a lot of little slices and a long key of color coding like we see on the bottom left in that pie chart that has like 9, 8.
Yeah, it's very
triple that, then that wouldn't be something that would be easy to follow. That is the one thing, it's color coded. And a lot of times we do try to, when it fits, instead of having a key to make even less effort, we'll put the option on like in the pie section if there's an opportunity, just so it's even less than a reader has to match. But that I think that's where we definitely use it. The spots that of course you can't use it as well is when you have like a multi-select where they can select multiple options, that we tend to do more like the bar charts type of idea for. But I think that a pie chart is definitely one of the very useful tools, or what they call a donut chart, like the one with the hole in it. Similar idea. It's easily like the idea of the bar chart. It's easily showing what percentage visually something is having.
Yeah, because if you're looking at the one on the left, there's absolutely that color confusion where you're seeing 20%, but I have no idea what is correlating with that 20%. It's very it's confusing just to look at it. And if I'm looking at something quickly, I would have to take extra effort again than I would have necessarily wanted to, compared to something like the Pac-Man versus not Pac-Man. I can very easily distinguish which of that is Pac-Man versus what's not.
Yeah, so that's why definitely when we're doing something like the bar chart on the left there, we use distinct colors. So it is easily identifiable, similar to like the Pac-Man one, like you were saying. You should be able to easily, quickly grasp what color goes to what and not be comparing 17 shades of green when there isn't very much of a difference between them. So while we do sometimes use different shades of a similar color, of the same color, it's distinct. So you'll have a really dark, a medium, a really light. So you're not having to pretty much like drag the key on top to do color matching.
And do you think that this type of graph is like, where is it most commonly seen within the idea of maybe market research? Is it typically like demographic questions, or is it used for survey responses?
So we'll sometimes use it for demographic questions. We've been actually moving a lot more
To like infographics for our demographic. So like a yes, no, or like male, female, age, we will show that more visual. It also, we can show it if we're asking like a preference question. So say we're doing an ad test and we end up at the end exposing them to alternatives or multiple options. It's a clear way of showing which option did they prefer of the ones that we're asking. So like a preference question, those are some of the more popular times off the top of my head that we will use them.
Yeah, totally. All right, so we're going to transition now from this to a little bit more of I feel like heat maps are really having a moment, especially because of eye tracking being this technology where people are really interested in it. But heat maps, again, are used typically with eye tracking outputs, and it's this data visual where you actually see the distribution of where somebody or where a participant or a group of participants are looking in terms of their gaze points and their fixations. So like we have listed here, red is really high number of gaze points, yellow it's a little bit less, and then green is very limited. I actually, is that right? I think it should be the reverse.
No,
you're right. Sorry, my bad.
Yeah, no, it's the opposite. Like you think green is good, but in a lot of times when the heat map is generated, you want like the hot spots.
Yeah, like literally heat, right?
So
yeah.
like, the red is what really draws your attention, which is showing what has drawn other people's attention.
And sometimes we call it like you really burn in, right?
Yeah.
So people left their eyes focused so much on, the product and her face that it really burned in there.
Right. That's a good way to think about it. So places that are lacking anything, what would that be considered then?
On
So
this
the
type of map?
Yeah. So places, if there isn't anything, that means it didn't have gaze. It wasn't really being focused on.
Right. Okay.
Like not really seen, right?
Yeah.
And I think there is something important to think about specifically with like eye tracking, is that it's not that the person didn't see the curtains, right? Because you do see that in your periphery. It's just that where their focal point was is not on those curtains, for example, but they did see them.
Right. That makes sense. I mean, it's one of those things where it's like, if somebody's looking at something, even though it's not in their like direct visual attention, it's like, I really like that idea that you had of like burning into the person's face, that even like the focus here is clearly on the lady. It's not going to be on those curtains. So
yeah, there's a couple other interesting pieces of information that you can see from this, and sometimes another way that you can visualize it that I'll talk about in a second. But if you notice, like the brand name at the bottom didn't get that much attention. So that's kind of interesting. They did see it on the bottle, obviously, but where the big branding moment is, they didn't necessarily see it, which can become really evident if you were to look at this in the reverse way, right? So one way is to show like the red markings on here, it's burned in. The other is to take away the things that people quote unquote didn't see. And so if you did the reverse and only had, those parts where it's like red and yellow and greenish, like only saw that part of the image, then you would see how little of the picture they actually saw, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, totally.
Yeah, and that's, I think, a really interesting way when we're doing eye tracking that we look at it as well, with doing like the red, yellow, green, but also, like Michelle was explaining, the opposite of just kind of showing what did get heat instead of, and it makes it really, again, visually, it pops what was coming through and what wasn't, because everything else can be darkened.
Yeah, because you basically would not see that bottom logo.
Yeah. And I think one more thing is that to note that while this is most common for heat maps, there are other situations, for eye tracking, there are other situations that are done if it is like online quantitative, when you do like clicking. So there's exercises where you can ask someone to click the first thing they see if you're not doing eye tracking, and you can try to generate something similar, not exact points, but areas that are getting more attention versus less attention. So there's wouldn't exactly again look like this, but there's quote unquote heat maps and ideas of portraying something in this way if it is an image or an advertisement, even if it may not be eye tracking specifically.
That's really interesting. So I could see that being useful in something like a usability test where maybe a company is trying to get a person to get led to a certain pathway or direction within a website. So I could see that fitting really nicely for something that maybe they don't have access to doing the full eye tracking capabilities or whatnot. But that's a really good point to bring up. Right. So with this, I think we've kind of been touching on all the different ways that we could be using data visuals. And one thing is that graphs and data visuals like heat maps, what they're doing is really helping bring about this idea of behavioral change. And we are, again, still in the midst of the pandemic, unfortunately. So this idea of flatten the curve is very, very popular. And I just found this really interesting that the original graph on the right is from the place where it's cited right here from the CDC. And their audience with this was to focus on people that have a background in science and have that foundational understanding of outputs. And I find that graph does give a little bit more information, and it's really useful because it's catering to a specific audience. But when you shift over and you look at the one that's on the right, it is trying to communicate to the public. So they're changing the way that the data is being presented to make it a little bit easier to interpret, less time to process, and really get that message across, which I think is kind of the goal within data visualization is, we've said this a couple times, but really considering your audience and making graphs and making data visuals for, like, you have to consider who your audience is.
Yeah, and I think that this is a really good example, and something that we didn't really touch on is the idea of, even with the right graph, effective labeling and appropriate labeling and being clear and concise, because you can even put it in the right chart like this, but the difference between the left and the right is a lot more people are going to understand the one that has been updated for the general population, because when you have too many labels or things aren't very clear, it can get very hard for someone to still understand, even if it's in the right physical graph.
Yeah, because the ultimate goal of any data visualization is really to make it easy to understand the data, right?
Absolutely. Getting from point A to point B as quickly as possible.
Right.
Great. So when it comes to this, really ties in nicely to what we were talking about, and what Amanda was getting at is making sure that we have that effective labeling, that you want to make sure that your data is able to tell you the way that people are behaving and tell you a bit about the story. So that way the takeaway message is very clear and it's very obvious and isn't really overwhelming either, where we've seen a couple examples within this, like on the very first slide when we were talking about that lady, that it could be overwhelming if there's just too much being thrown at somebody.
Absolutely. And, you know, I think also I really like the sort of meme joke there on the right about the outlier, and understanding what that can do to data, understanding the differences between means and medians, which, you know, I don't think we really got into a lot, but there's a lot out there to really learn about. And it's valuable for everybody. So not just people that are working in market research or consumer research, but for the general public, because you do see data visualizations in the news and you see it on food products, you know, and being able to understand what it means, what's that difference between the mean and the median, or what can an outlier do, and, you know, just understanding data a little bit better will make you a better consumer and, you know, a more thoughtful member of society, you know, for taking in news, all those sorts of things. There's a lot of really good, important reasons to learn about data visualization.
Yeah, and I think that that's a whole nother level that, I mean, is almost sounds like a whole nother conversation. Is there's like, even if you have the right graph, when that's what we've kind of been touching on, is the different actual graph options, but what you put in the graph is also really important. So like I was saying before, when you have like when we do Likert scales, like 7-point scales, 9-point scales, what are we showing from that? Because I'm not going to necessarily show everyone who said 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then like we do groupings of top 2, bottom 2, top 3, bottom 3, mean. You're not going to throw all of that all on the same slide all at once necessarily, but what are we showing and what does that mean? And how do you pull that out is a whole nother approach to it, but definitely understanding what it's telling you, and that there is a lot beyond like an outlier. There is a lot beyond just the surface of collecting questions and answers.
There's so much to think about in what you just shared. It seems like we may have to have you return.
I'm sure there's a whole nother set we can do specifically around those sort of issues.
Yeah.
But maybe we'll save that for another time. And so I think with that, I think we'll close out this conversation. I want to thank Amanda again for joining us. If you do have a question specifically for her, or would like to reach out to her to talk about, what we do at HCD with analytics, please feel free to contact her at this email. As always, the first thing we'd love you to do at the close of this is to go look down below and click like on this video. Leave a comment for us if you like. Reach out to us on LinkedIn. You can email Kathryn or I, or tweet with us, or visit our blog, any of these billions of ways to reach out on social media and the internet. But we're so happy to have you join us again. Special thanks to our guest, and we will talk to you again next time.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.